To the first of our talks in a new series on the cemeteries and burial grounds of the Commonwealth. We have a wonderful group of speakers lined up over the coming weeks who will be focusing on cemeteries in different Commonwealth countries. But to start our series off, what better subject could there be than the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, an organisation which looks after cemeteries and memorials in over 150 countries around the world, and they commemorate people from across the Commonwealth. I'm truly delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Chris McLean, who is the Senior Works Manager for the CWGC. A Canadian, he's based in the UK and has been travelling to, or has travelled to many countries to visit CWGC sites. His background is as a civil engineer and more recently in building conservation. He's responsible for the oversight of structural projects around the world for the CWGC and promotes a conservation-based approach to the maintenance and repairs of the CWGC's estate. I had the privilege of travelling with Chris to Kohima and Imphal back in 2017, so I know that you're in for a treat this evening with his talk. I won't say any more as I believe he's going to be mentioning Kohima later on. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, do put them in the chat, and I'll hand over to Chris now.
Thank you, Rowena. Did that work just before I start yakking away? All right, perfect. As Rowena said, I'm Chris McLean. I'm the Senior Works Manager for the CWGC. This presentation this evening, I'm going to go through the history and architecture of the CWGC and how we're maintaining and conserving our sites today and going ahead in the future. I think someone's not muted, so if possible. I'm also going to get an overview of the approach we take to maintaining our estate and some of the recent and current projects highlighting the work, as well as some of the challenges that we're currently facing and we anticipate we're going to be facing in the future. So I'm going to broken down into 4 separate parts. First bit's about the global commitment, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about our cemeteries, the architects and how they were designed, and a number of examples of some of the more iconic sites, as well as some of the smaller sites, and then what we're doing now with our conservation-based approach and some of the challenges that we're facing. So the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as Rowena said, it's over 150 countries. We commemorate more than 1.6 million war dead. It's closer to 1.7 now. 23,000 separate burial sites around the world, and in over 150 countries and territories. Of those casualties, more 935,000 of them we have identified casualties, over 200,000 unidentified casualties, and then 760,000 names of those missing that are inscribed on memorials. Those are what we call the memorials to the missing. We have over 1,200 directly employed staff around the world, and we are broken down into 5 different areas of remit. So we have something called CAPA, which looks after Canada and the Americas, as well as the Far East. And then we have UKNA, which looks after United Kingdom, Scandinavia. France area looks after France and Spain, and Switzerland, and Central and Southern Europe area, it's a new one, looks after anything that touches the Mediterranean, essentially, in Europe, as well as Belgium, Germany, Poland. And we have Africa, Asia area, which looks after Africa and Asia up to as far afield as India. And then there's also the Australian agency, which is a little bit separate from us, but they work alongside us. And we have the New Zealand agency, which looks after war graves in New Zealand. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, it's formed of the 6 member governments. So when it was initially formed, so we have the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India on its own, because at the time India was undivided, and South Africa. Those are the 6 member governments who fund the commission. So Fabian, the Imperial War Graves Commission was formed in 1917 by Royal Charter. Fabian Ware who was too old to fight in the First World War, was a commander of the mobile unit of the British Red Cross. And he was driven to ensure that the final resting place of the fallen were commemorated. And he began recording and caring for all the graves they could find on the battlefield. This is unusual because prior to this, there wasn't a lot of commemoration of individual soldiers. There was memorials to famous officers or famous people who died in battle, but generally the average soldier was not really commemorated. So this was a change from things that were done in the past. And in 1915, his work was given official recognition by the War Office, and it was incorporated as a unit of the British Army, and it was called the Graves Registration Unit. And the Imperial War Graves Commission came into effect on 21st of May 1917, and it was established by a royal charter, with the Prince of Wales serving as the president, and Fabian Ware was the vice chairman. The picture here shows King George V visiting Tynecott Cemetery, which is our largest cemetery, in his 1922 pilgrimage, along with Fabian Ware and Field Marshal Haig. We've also got Major Binnie and John Reginald Truelove as one of the architects in the photo as well. In 1960, it was renamed the Commonwealth War Graves Commission as it was considered more appropriate as the British Empire was essentially divesting itself of all the colonies. So the commission renamed itself in keeping with when the Commonwealth was formed. So as I mentioned earlier, Tynecott Cemetery. We have over 2,000 constructed war cemeteries around the world. And when we say constructed, it's essentially a site with physical graves or a memorial, and then structural features such as, which I'll go into a little bit later. So I'll talk a little bit about the other features, but we have the Cross of Sacrifice, which is our most iconic stone of remembrance. We have shelter buildings, seating areas, and lots of walls. So this is Tynecott Cemetery. As I mentioned, it's the largest cemetery we have. Over 11,900 war graves. 35,000 names are commemorated on the Tynecott Memorial, which is at the rear of the cemetery, the round section. And it's visible as a curved wall to the rear of the cemetery. Many of the casualties in Tynecott too, we have the remains, but many of them are unidentified. So looking at that photograph, thousands of those casualties they're unknown. So we have the remains, but we couldn't identify them. But if someone is buried and it says identified on the headstone, they're commemorated on a memorial, either in it could be on the Tynecott Memorial, or it could be on one of the other nearby memorials. From our largest to our smallest cemetery. This is a small cemetery on the east coast of United States in North Carolina on a small island, Ocracoke. We have 4 war dead in the cemetery. 2 of them are unidentified. The 2 of them are identified. They died when the armed trawler HM Trawler Bedfordshire was torpedoed in 1942, and the bodies washed ashore. They were recovered and they were buried. So one of the challenges we're facing, this cemetery was almost completely destroyed. It's a small one. It was almost completely destroyed in a hurricane in 2019, but was quickly restored by the U.S. Coast Guard, who look after the cemetery on our behalf. As I mentioned, we have many directly employed staff around the world, but we also rely on local contractors in the UK, councils, and volunteers to look after our more isolated graves in the UK and around the world. So we have over 308,000 Commonwealth War dead buried in the United Kingdom, or commemorated on memorials in the United Kingdom, in over 13,000 different locations. If you go into any churchyard in the UK, you'll probably come across one of our war graves. Talk a little bit about the design approach and how we came across, or how the cemeteries developed into what we see today. So if you go into any of our sites around the world, you should be able to recognize it at one of our sites as part of our historic estate. They're all unique in their own design, and they fit into the local landscape using local materials where possible. So different stone types are used. Aside from Portland limestone, which is very much our stone, we tended to use local stones when fabricating our walls and memorials and other structures in the cemeteries. And we have certain features which we consider iconic to the Commission. So I'll talk a little bit about the architects now. So shortly after the Commission was established by the Royal Charter, Sir Frederick Kenyon, who at the time was the director of the British Museum, was tasked with writing a report setting about how the cemeteries would be designed. And in this report, Kenyon provides the overarching principles of the commission, our architectural layout, and the design features for the cemeteries. It was then up to the principal architects who were appointed, Sir Edwin Lutyens, Sir Herbert Baker, and Sir Reginald Blomfield, and then later Charles Holden, to undertake the actual design work. The central feature to be included in each cemetery was a war cross. The war cross was designed by Reginald Blomfield, and a war stone, which was designed by Lutyens. These are now very common. You'll see a cross in most of our cemeteries, constructed cemeteries around the world, and stones of remembrance in the larger cemeteries. And while no two cemeteries are exactly the same, they all have a similar pattern. And they were all based on the initial design for one of the trial cemeteries, as they were called at the time. There was 3 of them. One of them is called Forestville Communal Cemetery Extension, which I'll show you a little bit about in a second. This was the first cemetery designed by Blomfield. Typically, our cemeteries are surrounded by stone or brick walls, in some cases hedges, and entrance gates into the cemeteries. And on the columns, as you approach the cemetery, we'll have the name of the cemetery in a stone plaque at the entrance or over the entrance feature. Most sites, along with these features, will also have a bronze register box, which contains the inventory of the burials and a plan of the plots. So the register box is essentially, it's a small door which you open up, and inside we keep the names of all the casualties buried in the cemeteries and the location, so it's easy for someone who's visiting to be able to identify a specific casualty. So, key feature, the first one, cross of sacrifice. So Kenyon felt that although the stone of remembrance was a great symbol for a common sacrifice, the cemeteries would need something to represent the faith of the many. At the time, UK was very much a Christian country. So Reginald Blomfield wished to create something that would represent the great sacrifice of these men, and it would be a symbolic of their ideals. The design features short cross arms, which are very close to the top of the shaft, which itself is tapered using the optical correction of entasis. Entasis is the design mechanism where it draws the lines of the cross are not actually straight, they're actually curved in a very gentle arch, and it draws the eyes up to the top. So it's not straight, it's actually semi-curved, same with the stone of remembrance. And the cross itself is adorned with a bronze crusader's sword, symbolic of the sacrifice, and the stone itself, typically white, principally Portland limestone in many of our cemeteries, but we also use other French limestones and other limestones in Belgium. We have other types of stone too. So if you go to the Midlands, UK, around Derbyshire, we used a lot of sandstone, right up to the north of England. And then you get into Scotland, we have granite, Canada as well, very much granite. South African is local granites. And then we have some Botticino limestone, which is a very common it's a very common stone used in the Mediterranean, and we also have them in India and Asia. The base of the cross itself is octagonal and allows very much a lot of flexibility in the design. So the cross of sacrifice is identifiable, but it's not always simply placed in the cemetery. It's incorporated into other features within the cemetery, which you'll see in a little bit. And then, unlike the stone of remembrance, Blomfield allowed for the variation in height. So there's 4 different types of cross of sacrifice, depending on the number of casualties in the cemetery. The smallest one is we call the A1, which is the one you see in the picture here. That's an A. A1 is a smaller one. It's about 14 feet tall for the smallest one, and the largest one goes out to about 24 feet. The small one is up from 40 to 250 casualties, and then the larger up you go, you have larger crosses depending on the number of casualties in the cemetery. And the largest one we call is a Type C, and that's only used in very special cases, very large cemeteries. Brookwood Military Cemetery has one, El Alamein War Cemetery in Egypt has one, and Tynecott in Belgium. And then due to the flexibility, the cross could be placed in different locations within the cemetery. It's not always central, it's a focal point. So it draws the cross draws you into a certain part of the cemetery, and it's located in a specific way to give lines to the cemetery. And Blomfield's war cross is probably the most widely recognized monuments of war, and it's widely copied. If you go into many cemeteries and war memorials in villages, the design has been copied from our original cross. Yeah, Stone of Remembrance, I've mentioned that in passing. So shortly after the commission was founded, Lutjens wrote to Fabian Ware and suggested a simple yet poignant design for the war stone. It would be 3.5 meters by 1.5 meters and would sit on 3 shallow steps, and ensures that this monument would be visible between the rows of headstones. It's a little bit taller than the actual height of the headstone. This monolithic altar would commemorate those of all faiths and none. It's not a Christian symbol, but it's an altar. So it was designed to be a multi-faith symbol in the cemeteries, and it's a symbol of common sacrifice. And again, the stone was designed using entasis. So again, it looks like straight edges, but it's actually curved edges, and it draws you up. There's a point, I think if you could draw the circles that the corners create, I think it goes up to about 1,000 meters. So there's a point 1,000 meters in the sky where all the corners actually meet. And this it was originally called the War Stone, but it is now more recognized as the Stone of Remembrance. And the inscription that's inscribed on the side of the memorial, "Their name liveth forevermore." It was chosen by Rudyard Kipling, who was employed as the literary art advisor for the War Graves Commission, the Imperial War Graves Commission at the time. He lost his son in the war, and he wanted to be involved when we were setting up. The simple epitaph that is synonymous with the event is "Their name liveth forevermore." Usually it's only in English. We have a couple of sites where it's not. So in Canada, we have it on one of the cemeteries in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is the only Stone of Remembrance we have there. And in Benny-sur-Mer Canadian Cemetery is the only site I've seen outside of Canada where we have it written in English on one side and French on the other. Canada is a bilingual country, hence the reason. Due to the size and weight, these Stones of Remembrance actually weigh about 8 tons. Not easy to move, they're not easy to assemble. They're only seen in the larger cemeteries. So typically a cemetery that has more than 1,000 burials would have that. In theory, we have lots of exceptions in the commission, and I'll show you the first cemetery as an example of that. So this is one of the original designs for the first cemetery. It was signed off by Reginald Blomfield. If you look I think I can zoom in on there. You can see it was signed off by Reginald Blomfield in 1919. So this is the first cemetery that was created. It's called Forceville Communal Cemetery Extension. It's about 20 minutes from Tietval if you've been to the area. Small hidden away cemetery behind a civil cemetery. It's got the classic elements of the cemetery. We've got the Stone of Remembrance at the rear of the cemetery. And then we have the Cross of Sacrifice central. And you'll see there one of the lines of sight. So we have a central line between the Cross of Sacrifice and the Stone of Remembrance. And then we have, mentioned earlier, shelter buildings and entrance features. A lot of our cemeteries have a small building where the register box would be held, possibly a small resting place for people to sit. Hence we call them shelter buildings. And then paving is very common in our sites. We have lots of pathways, but as this site, it's 103 years old now, things change. So here's a picture on the left of Forceville Cemetery Extension not long after it was built. This was some family members visiting the grave of, I'm guessing, one of their relatives. You'll see in the picture here, you have the Stone of Remembrance in the back left with a footpath down the middle. You look at the picture that I took last week, it's gone. We've adapted some of the sites over time. It's possible the pathway was taken out because there was issues maintaining the pathway. We have records of some of the changes that are made, and recently we've been working on conservation statements and conservation management plans for our site. So we're trying to have an easily accessible document for us to track the changes in the sites and how they've evolved. If we're going to make changes, we don't want to change things back to what they originally were without knowing why. So there might have been a very good reason for taking out the path, so we wouldn't reinstate the path unless there was good reason to, and find out why it was taken out in the first place. And again, site's over 100 years old, so the original trees, the trees in that picture on the right are not the original trees. They were probably changed about 10 or 15 years ago, looking at the size of them. Headstones, key feature, but again, we have many different types. We've got over 1.1 million headstones in our cemeteries around the world, 33 different styles, and more than 25 different types of stone, probably quite a bit more than that, but those are the stone types that were commonly used. So most of our headstones are produced in the headstone production facility near Arras in France. Conservation-based approach ensures that our headstones now are only replaced when absolutely necessary. When I first joined the commission in 2011, we were really ramping up production of replacement headstones, and we were up to about 20 to 25,000 headstones a year were being replaced. Looking back at this, and then as we were evaluating this, we considered this to be an excessive use of a limited natural resource. Stone is finite, it's very expensive, and we revisited how and when we would replace our headstones. And we consider these headstones now to have historical significance. They're not just a piece of stone. They have value to the family members. They have value to the cemetery and the wider community. So we were taking out headstones when we probably shouldn't have been doing it. They were, if there was an issue with the headstone, sometimes we would take them out, or we would take out a whole row of headstones if one or two of them weren't looking particularly good. It's not sustainable, and it was the wrong approach. So we created some criteria for inspecting headstones and what is and what isn't acceptable for a headstone in a cemetery. From that 20 to 25,000 headstones we were replacing in 2013, we currently replace only about 1,400 a year. So we dropped it by about 95%. And just for a cost example, a cost of a single headstone, just to buy the blank headstone, costs us about £160 from the quarry. So that's before it's shipped, before we do anything with it. So a lot of money. We're on a fixed budget from the various member governments that are paying for us. So we have to ensure that we're spending the money wisely, and we're also looking out for the environment and not wasting resources. And where possible, when a headstone when the legibility of the headstone is no longer commemorating the casualty, we re-engrave where possible. In France and Belgium, where the sites are close together and we have a large number of staff, we re-engrave headstones in situ. So we have teams that go around the cemeteries and they re-engrave or tidy up the headstone, or make amendments to headstones if there's a change on the headstones that required. We have teams in France and Belgium that re-engrave. Also in Turkey, we have a team, but sites in the UK, very far afield, we have limited staff in the UK. So where possible, we would re-engrave a headstone, but we tend to, most of the re-engraving is done in France and Belgium. And France and Belgium alone, they re-engrave about 15,000 headstones a year. Takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on the complexity of the headstone, for one person to re-engrave a headstone. It's a lot of work. That's 30,000 hours of work every year that we do on re-engraving headstones. Some of our most common headstones, so I'm not showing you all of them because we have loads. The top left is the standard commission headstone. That's the most common one you'll find in most of our cemeteries where we're using that type of stone. I'll go on to a few changes or a few exceptions and variations. And then the next one is a non-war headstone. Those are used for people who died interwar, so between the First and Second World Wars, prior to the First World War. It's also used for civilians. And then the next two headstones are post-war Army, Navy, and RAF. So those headstones we use for casualties that Ministry of Defense are using currently, and we look after a number of what we call non-war graves, Ministry of Defense headstones in various cemeteries and sites around the world as well on their behalf. Admiralty markers, unusual ones, those predate the commission, that design, but the Admiralty was still using them into the 1920s. So we have some that are considered war graves, others that are considered not war graves, but we maintain them as we would a regular commission headstone. And then some agents are foreign headstones. So we have a lot of foreign headstones in our cemeteries around the world. Here's a couple of examples. That's a Belgian headstone in Oxford Botley. That's a World War I Belgian headstone. And then we have Belgian World War II headstones, just for a bit of variation. The Belgian World War I headstones actually have a bronze panel in a bronze plaque with the casualty details on them. Really nice pieces of design, and that's a Belgian blue limestone that we use, or that they use for those headstones. The one in the middle is a Czechoslovakian headstone, and then Netherlands, Polish headstones. And then here's an example of a hand-drawn, our drawing office in the UK draw up any of the German headstones that require replacing. So that is an example of what would be drawn up for the team in France to produce a new headstone if we were requiring a replacement. And then we have other things. You might come across these in the UK. They're quite common, and we're starting to use them in other sites. So these are called Type 24 AC, means alternative commemoration. So these Type 24 memorials, they're about twice the size of a regular commission headstone. The large markers used on sites to extend an existing memorial. So when we have large memorials, if we have a large memorial, Pozières Memorial, if anybody's been to Pozières in France, or Arras and Faubourg-Gamier, we have lots of large memorials where they weren't designed to take more casualties than were originally intended. And in the past, the commission would, if names had to be assigned to this memorial. So these memorials have specific dates, battlefield deaths. So if someone died during a certain battle, they were assigned to a specific memorial. So if the casualty was to go on that memorial, we would use the space available on the existing panels. But once those panels are full, again, these memorials have heritage value. We shouldn't be just putting pieces of stone everywhere or adding names in places where they weren't originally designed. So we took the decision about six years ago to no longer add new panels to a memorial. We can replace a panel, or if a name on a memorial is no longer commemorating the casualty. So we do find remains on the battlefield sites, and if a casualty is identified, he gets his own headstone, or her headstone, and the name on the memorial is no longer the point of commemoration, it's the actual headstone. So we do have spaces that come up on the memorials on occasion, but we have large numbers of casualties that are discovered or assigned to a memorial. We don't have the space. So we use these Type 24 memorials in certain locations, and we put them in a location where it's sort of sympathetic to the site. So it would be in a cemetery, a memorial where we have other headstones, and we place them in a location which is not going to be too intrusive. Try to get them to blend in with the site as much as possible. Gallipoli markers. So these Gallipoli markers are the small plaques that you'll see at the foot of these headstones, and I'll explain why we use those here. But most common in Turkey. So our cemeteries in Turkey, the Balkans, and northern Greece, these are the flat markers that are used. They sit on a small plinth, and they're a commission headstone. They're just a Gallipoli marker, and they were put in these locations because at the time the ground conditions were considered unstable, and the headstones, when they're aligned in rows, if there's earthquakes or if the ground settles, they become out of alignment. So the decision was taken at the time to use these small markers. They don't come out of alignment, and they're easy to install, and they're easy to readjust if required. And we've started using these. You'll see here, these are private memorials, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we use these when we need to install a commission grave marker on a site that's not where it wasn't originally intended. So I'll talk about private memorials in a few minutes. And then finally, the other one that's very common, which you'll only see out in the Far East, from Northeast India up to Japan, is bronze pedestal markers. We use them in Northern India, as I mentioned, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Myanmar or Burma, Indonesia, Japan, and Thailand. So we use these in place of traditional headstones. Again, the Australians use something similar too in some of their sites. And I'll talk a little bit about how we maintain these now, because we've taken a different approach to that, but that'll come into my conservation bit a little bit further on. So talk you through the various layout of a standard commission headstone. So the headstone allows for personal and service details, religious emblem if the family so chose, a personal inscription, which is up to 4 lines at the bottom of a headstone. Next of kin were invited to choose their own wording to be engraved at the foot of the headstone. First World War, the family were charged by the letter to put them on. Second World War, the commission decided not to charge for them, but so you'll see a lot of World War I headstones that don't have private inscriptions on, because there was a charge for it at the time. The exception to the private inscription or personal inscriptions on the bottom of a headstone is New Zealand. They don't allow personal inscriptions on their headstones. New Zealand government at the time said no. So regimental unit or service badge, that's at the top. And then we have the particulars of the service, particulars, regiment, regiment number, regimental number, rank, name, the regiment itself. So this one here, you've got the regimental badge, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and then the regiment itself is spelled out on the line, and then date of death and the age itself. So if the age of the casualty was known or identified at the time, we would put the age on the headstone as well. And then, as I said, religious emblem. We have a lot of religious emblems. We have Christian crosses. We have Star of David for Jewish casualties. We have inscriptions for Muhammad, for Muslims. We have inscriptions for Buddhists. There's seven or eight different religious emblems that are used across the commission. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the personal inscription. Private memorials, I touched on this earlier. A lot of them in the UK. There's over 37,000 in the UK. And these were chosen by the casualties next of kin. A lot of people came back injured from the war, First World War, and they died before the end of the war. But they were invalided home, so they didn't actually die on the battlefield. So a lot of them were the family members, they were buried in family plots or in local churchyards, hence the large number of commission casualties around the UK, over 306,000. So these are just a couple of examples of private memorials, and I just wanted to show you various examples. We don't actually own these memorials. These are family private graves owned by the family. So we're very leery about doing anything with them. Hence, I mentioned earlier the small Gallipoli markers that we put on the graves when they're no longer commemorating adequately. So our primary duty of the commission is to ensure that the casualties, the particulars of a war casualty, are recorded in perpetuity forevermore. And we ensure that the names and the details on a private memorial are adequately commemorated. So because the family at the time didn't have a commission headstone put up, they might have chosen not to at the time. So like I said, we're very careful on what we do and how we do things. But this one here, family member put up a Maurice Robinson Dennison, clearly a war grave, died of active service, died of wounds, so they came back. And if you died during the periods that the commission commemorates, so from beginning of the First World War up to end of December 1921, so up into January 1st, 22, and then for the Second World War, it's up to 1947, end of 1947. So if you died in active duty up to between those dates, you were entitled to a war grave. Some people chose at the time not to have one, or they might not have even been aware that they were entitled to one. So if someone came home in 1916 and died of wounds in 1918, they probably didn't think they were entitled to a war grave, but they are. So we do come across, and we do, if the casualties grave marker doesn't commemorate adequately, we would offer to put up a headstone for them. So there's over 37,000 across the UK. Most are in good condition, but they're over 100 years old in some cases. They're in cemeteries, which are, some are maintained quite nicely, some are not maintained at all. So we do struggle with these. So I'm going to move on to the architects now who designed the cemeteries, and you'll see some of the larger memorials and who designed them. So the principal architects I mentioned earlier: Edward Lutyens, Herbert Baker, Reginald Blomfield. So the commission at the outset was determined to employ the very best architects of their day and design our cemeteries and memorials. In 1918, three principal architects, Sir Edward Lutyens, Sir Reginald Blomfield, and Sir Herbert Baker, were appointed, and they were supported by various assistant architects. Sir Edward Lutyens was best known for the Thiepval Memorial in France, the Delhi Memorial India Gate, and Tower Hill Memorial in London, right across from the Tower of London. He also designed the cenotaph in Whitehall every year, where the ceremony for Remembrance Sunday takes place in London every year. It's not cared for by the commission. It's not a commission memorial, but the design you see in a number of our memorials that he helped or that he designed later on. Herbert Baker, he designed Tynecott Cemetery, largest commission cemetery in the world, and certainly the most well-known of our estate. He also worked in India and South Africa, where he designed a number of government buildings. Mentioned earlier, Reginald Blomfield was very patriotic, conventional commission architect. He designed over 118 of our cemeteries. He was very prolific in the First World War. He also designed the Men and Gate Memorial in Ypres, where the last post ceremony is held every day, and still draws in large crowds, larger and larger crowds since I started 10 years ago. When you go, there's hundreds of people there. After the Second World War, war ended. We had lots of cemeteries and lots of casualties to commemorate. So we appointed another series of architects of the time again. Edward Moff is one of our principal architects. He was the principal architect for this after the Second World War. He designed the Air Forces Memorial at Runnymede. Also designed the extension to Tower Hill Memorial, which is the one I said across from London. We have a lot of memorials where extensions were created. We have the naval memorials at Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham. They were originally designed by Lutyens, big towers, and then the Second World War came. We wanted to keep them together but separate at the same time. So each of these three memorials have annexes created around them. So the Second World War casualties are separate from the First World War, but they're all in one site. And the picture here you see on the left, this was the Queen visiting in 1953. I think it was one of the first official visits she actually did after she became Queen, unveiling the Runnymede Memorial. Next picture here I'll show you. That's the day of the unveiling. Thousands of people were there. It's a huge site, and those are all seats for the people that attended. Worthington, Sir Hubert Worthington was the principal architect for Egypt and North Africa. Climate, terrain, very challenging conditions. El Alamein War Cemetery, which I'll show you a picture of in a few minutes. More than 7,000 graves consolidated there after the Battle of El Alamein. Heliopolis War Cemetery, which is one of the largest cemeteries in just outside of Cairo. And then we had Philip Hepworth was the principal architect for Northwest Europe. He designed cemeteries in Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, including the Bayeux Memorial and the Dunkirk Memorial. And then not all of our cemeteries are very grand, iconic cemeteries, and some of them don't follow the more traditional designs. So this one here is a small cemetery called Hunter's Cemetery. There's only 41 casualties on the site. The site was created by the Army in 1916 following the successful second attack on Beaumont Hamel. A large shell crater was made during the fighting, and they used that crater to bury some of the soldiers who died on site. So hence the circular design for the cemetery. And you'll see the headstones themselves it's not traditional, but they're incorporated into the wall of the surrounding of the cross of sacrifice. So the remains were all buried together. So there's not individual remains in front of each of those headstones, but they're all buried in the single location. Challenging, and it was a different and just a design at the time that suited the needs of the location, because we didn't have the locations of the graves, but we knew they were all there, so the decision was made to put headstones in that fashion. But we have the traditional wall, we have the entrance feature, the gates, and the name of the cemetery is written on the wall. Chiapval Memorial, designed by Lutyens, largest Commonwealth memorial to the missing in the world. There's over 72,000 casualties on the memorial. Construction began in 1928. The finished memorial was unveiled in 1932 by Prince Edward, then Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VIII. Panels on the top, dedicatory panels in English and French, were added due to the mixed Anglo-French cemetery at the rear. In the back of the cemetery, there are 300 French and 300 Commonwealth graves at the back of the cemetery with the cross of sacrifice. And it's unusual to see the French and English on a memorial, but it was chosen then because there was French and English casualties in the cemetery behind. It's one of our most famous pieces of architecture, internationally recognized, a symbolic representation of the cost of the First World War. It was submitted for consideration as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018. Very complex structure. Lutyens loved his flat roofs. Anything he designed, anything that he designed that we maintain, we have issues with flat roofs, drainage. They look great, they're hard to maintain. So we had to do a large two-phase restoration of this memorial. First started in 2014, brick repairs, removal of cement mortar, cleaning of the memorial, as well as fixing the waterproofing and drainage improvements. The inside of the memorial is, you can actually climb up inside the memorial to the top. We've got a whole series of drainage channels in there to keep the water flowing and off the memorial. Second phase, we just finished about 2 months ago, concentrated on similar works to the lower half of the memorial, as well as engraving and replacing name panels where necessary. The bricks used, they're very soft brick. And in the 70s and 80s, like most other organizations, we started using cement. Cement mortar was used. Cement is harder than brick, causes deterioration. So we had to address the issues before the memorial deteriorated any further. So that'll come up a little bit later in the conservation section. But large scale project, took over to, like I said, it was a year and a half for phase 2 and over a year for phase 1. So 2.5 years of work on site. And then just a couple of the other larger memorials. India Gate, the Delhi Memorial, designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens again. The Delhi Memorial, over 13,000 casualties commemorated. It's also a national memorial to all soldiers of undivided India who died between 1914 and 18. This memorial, like I said, it's the national memorial for India now. Limits our access to the memorial, control of the memorial. We commemorate names on it, but we struggle to get at it, and we don't work on it because it's considered to be property of the Indian government now. On the right, the Vimy Memorial. This is the Canadian government's national memorial. While it's not a CWGC memorial itself, it was designed and built by the Canadian government. On the memorial, there's over 11,000 names on the lower part of the memorial. Those names are points of commemoration for us. So we maintain the names, and we also actually maintain the memorial itself on behalf of Veterans Affairs Canada. So it's not our site, but we look after it for them. And all those 11,000 were Canadians who died in France and have no known grave. So it's their memorial to the missing. It's one of my favorites. This is Kranji War Cemetery in Singapore. At the top of this Kranji War Cemetery, we have the Singapore Memorial. Over 24,000 casualties are commemorated on here. Commonwealth Land and Air Forces who have no known grave. The forces are commemorated. The land forces commemorated by the memorial died during campaigns in Malaya and Indonesia, or in subsequent captivity when the Japanese invaded and took over Singapore and Malaysia, Burma, Thailand. So many of these on the memorial died during the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, or the Death Railway as it was known, or at sea while being transported into imprisonment elsewhere. The memorial also commemorates airmen who died during the operations over the whole of Southern and Southeast Asia and surrounding seas and oceans. So it's probably one of our largest memorials outside of the Rangoon Memorial out in Southeast Asia. Memorial itself was designed by Colin St. Clair Oakes, very symbolic memorial design, and it was unveiled in 1957. The columns represented the columns of the army, the wings denote the wings of an aircraft, and the rising central fin represents the conning tower of a submarine. Fantastic memorial, Art Deco, my favorite style of architecture. So it's one of my favorite memorials. Beautiful. The clever and different design was quite modernistic for the commission. Said we were very classical in the past. This was very much a deviation from the norm for the commission, but it really stands out. Beautiful memorial. El Alamein War Cemetery out in Egypt. Sir Hubert Worthington designed this one. Over 7,000 casualties of the Second World War from the desert campaigns. And of those 7,240 casualties, 815 are unidentified. There's also over 100 war graves from other nationalities. And we have the El Alamein Memorial, which commemorates over 12,000 casualties who have no known grave. This one here is very different from our traditional sites. It's in the middle of the desert. We call this a dry site, where we have plants which are better suited to the local climate and environment. To irrigate this and keep grass growing there, it would be impossible. So we wisely took the decision to be sympathetic with the environment and plant suitable planting, and it's more easy to maintain. Originally, Portland headstones were put in this cemetery, and there's still quite a few in there. But over the last 20, 30 years, the headstones started deteriorating quite quickly. One year they'd be fine, and then the whole face of the headstone would just fall off the front of the headstone. That was due to the very high salt contents in the soil. Portland's a very porous stone. When it rained or it got wet, the water would come up into the headstone. Then they would dry out, the salts would remain and break off the front of the headstone. So we started using a limestone called Botticino, which is the one we use more commonly in Italy. It's a lot more resistant to salt. We try to replace stone like for like where possible, but we also don't do it where we know it's the wrong type of stone for the cemetery. So here we wouldn't put Portland back, we use Botticino. Kohima War Cemetery. You go, Rowena. Took these pictures when I was out there in 2017 with Rowena. So this one here again was designed by Colin St. Clair Oakes. This is up in northeast India, right on the Burma-Thai border. Northeast India, World War II cemetery, over 1,400 burials marked with bronze pedestal markers. So a very different style of marker. You saw the earlier close-up of that. We also have the Kohima Cremation Memorial at the top. So we have these cremation memorials in sites from Italy as far afield as Japan. These are memorials where the names of the casualties are commemorated after the remains were cremated in line with Sikh and Hindu soldiers' wishes. So we still need to commemorate them. We wouldn't put up a headstone because there are no remains actually there. So we use these cremation memorials to commemorate. I mentioned earlier too, the cross of sacrifices, we sort of incorporate them into different things. This is again one of my favorite variations on a cross of sacrifice. This is a shelter building, and there's 4 areas where people can sit and look out onto the cemetery. And just places of contemplation with the cross on top. And if you see the lines leading away from the cross itself, these are the original lines from the tennis court. The cemetery itself is on the part incorporated the deputy commissioner's bungalow, so there's very serious fighting there, and these lines itself are actually layout. You can actually see the layout of the original tennis court, and we incorporated that as part of the design feature for the cemetery. And further afield, these are some of the more remote locations. Suva Military Cemetery in Fiji. We commemorate Fijian and New Zealand casualties from the Second World War. And we also have a small memorial called the Suva Memorial there that commemorates 34 soldiers with no known graves. And these people, either the grave locations were lost or they were sites where we could no longer maintain them on some of the more isolated islands in Fiji. So the decision was taken at the time, if we couldn't maintain them, they would be commemorated elsewhere. And that's why we have memorials in certain countries where we have the names of the casualties there, because we just couldn't maintain the graves. And then this one here, Stanley Military Cemetery in the Falkland Islands, or not Stanley, no, Stanley Cemetery. It's a civilian cemetery, but we have military graves in the cemetery. It's most southerly cross of sacrifice in the world that we have. Cemetery is Stanley's only cemetery. It's a population of about 2,500 people today, but there's 33 casualties of the Great War and Second World War, also 21 non-World War burials, which we look after. We also look after San Carlos Military Cemetery and a number of isolated graves from the 1982 Falklands War. They're not CWGC sites, but we look after them on behalf of the Ministry of Defense. And even after the Second World War, we're still discovering remains. So this was the last cemetery that was created in 2009. This is Fromelles Pheasantwood Cemetery in France, right near the Belgian border. The remains of 250 Australian and British casualties were discovered in a wood just near the village of Fromelles. And after the battle, the remains were discovered in old German positions behind Pheasantwood, and they were moved after the battle and reburied by the German army, but the location wasn't known to the Imperial War Graves Commission at the time, and they were rediscovered in 2009. A lot of casualties. We needed to commemorate them adequately or properly. So the commission decided at the time to build its first new cemetery in years. So this is the last cemetery, but the latest cemetery, but it's definitely not the last cemetery, because you'll see more in a few minutes. So this cemetery is designed in a hexagonal layout to incorporate the ground conditions. Ground conditions weren't fantastic for us to build on, but it's what we had to work with. So the design and the slope of the soil, so this octagonal layout was deemed the best at the time. It very much replicates other designs of cemeteries that we have in the area, traditional brick walls with the coping stones, cross of sacrifice, and the entrance feature. It was dedicated in 2010, and it was the first CWGC cemetery built in over 50 years. And then more recent projects, this was one I was involved in. This is the Abuja Memorial in Nigeria. The two statues and the memorial you'll see on the left-hand side was dismantled by the Nigerian authorities because they wanted to build something on our site. We thought the memorial was lost, or the panels were lost and the soldiers were lost, but as one of our inspectors came across them by chance when one of the Nigerian soldiers said, no, we have them over here. So we actually found them again, and we decided to reincorporate these sculptures as well as the original panels. We had all the World War I panels, over 1,000 casualties on them. So we decided to come up, or our architect at the time came up with a design to incorporate the old with the new. So the World War I casualty panels were existing. We had to cast another 1,000 newly identified casualties from the Second World War. So we built essentially with this incorporating the original statues. We created a new memorial. It's in a secure location in Nigeria. It's on a military base. And that was done in 2015. Sorry, we unveiled that. And the statues themselves are called Askari memorials. We also have those in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, as well as in Nairobi and Mombasa, Kenya. So there's 4 memorials where we incorporate these Askari warriors onto the memorials. Upcoming projects. So this is something that we're going to start already working on now in the planning phases, but as we did the Tiepval Memorial, this is another memorial. It's almost 100 years old. It's showing its age. We do need to we have been maintaining it, but there's some fairly serious issues or potential issues with the roof itself. So the memorial itself is over 54,000 Commonwealth soldiers commemorated on there. And it commemorates casualties from Australia, Canada, India, South Africa, and the United Kingdom, not New Zealand. They have their own memorial. They decided to have their own memorial nearby. So those are the 5 member governments are on the Menin Gate. This memorial was unveiled in 1927. And then since 1928, the last post, which is the bugles from the local fire station, come out every evening at 8 o'clock, and they sound the last post under the memorial. The only time it was interrupted since 1928 was the Second World War. The first night the firemen went out to play the bugles, the German soldiers took offense to it and they stopped it, and it didn't happen again until after the liberation. But every night since then, it's carried on. So renovation now. So we're doing planning permission and investigation this year. One of the big problems with the memorial is the top of the memorial was it's a stone and concrete structure, and in the 80s or 90s the miracle membrane was put on, something called Sarnafil, which is a rubber membrane. It's supposed to be a waterproofing membrane to keep the water out. It does, but it also traps water inside. So we're taking all of that off, and we're going to do a proper conservation restoration of the memorial. There's different options being discussed right now. We might even put a green roof on top of there. So a green roof would be essentially putting the vegetation on top of the memorial itself to encourage wildlife diversity. Not 100% decided yet, but it could be happening with the restoration of the memorial. We're also going to be repairing brickwork, stonework, and cleaning all the panels, and adding names to the memorial where required. It's going to be a challenging project too, though, because underneath the memorial, it's an active roadway. So we can't actually close the road because it's one of the few entrances into Ypres itself. So we have to do the work while keeping the road open at the same time. This is a very, very much in the planning phases, but loose British cemetery extension. So this is going to be an extension to an existing cemetery, but essentially its own cemetery of its own right, just adjacent to the loose British cemetery. So these casualties in 2018, they were working on a new hospital in France, close to the front line of the Somme. They discovered over 100 remains on the site. these remains were analyzed and recovered by our recovery unit in Beaurain, France. We have a dedicated team that if anybody's doing work in the area, or if a farmer uncovers remains, we send our team out to recover the remains, any artifacts, so we can try identify the casualties and give them a headstone. And even if we can't identify them, they would get a proper burial with a commissioned headstone. So the upcoming work too, they're also working on a large canal in that neck of the woods, and we're anticipating the discovery of about 700 additional sets of remains, possibly more, as the canal's being built. So we had to do something. Normally, if we find a small number of remains, they would be put into an existing cemetery. We have space in some cemeteries to bury them. This case, we would not have space for 700 casualties, so the decision was taken to build a new cemetery. On average, we find approximately 50 sets of remains. They're exhumed and taken care of by a recovery unit. And like I said, 700 would just overwhelm a cemetery. We just don't have space for it. So this is going to be, again, I said that was our last cemetery in 2009. This will be our next cemetery that we're building. And it's always possible, especially with development, that we have to do more in the future. This is an unusual one. So this is the new Cape Town Memorial in South Africa. This memorial itself is going to honor Black South African logistics troops who gave their lives during the First World War. These men made a huge contribution to the war effort by supplying frontline soldiers. They weren't combat troops, but they were supplying the combat troops with vital food and supplies, very much logistic side of things. Historic failings. Many of these people were not given the proper commemoration they deserved. We're rectifying this now. There's a huge research program going in place. We're identifying casualties that should have been commemorated and weren't. So this memorial here is going to rectify what we failed to do in South Africa. The identified casualties are part of a larger project commissioned by the CWGC. If you go to our website, you can find some information on it. Very interesting reading, a bit uncomfortable, but we're rectifying what should have been done at the time. So all of these, it's going to rectify the gaps that the commemoration of all servicemen, which we failed to do in some cases. And we're trying to rectify these issues now by creating these new memorials in consultation with locals. So this one here, very different approach. So this is the proposed design, or the approved design for this new memorial. Very much not a commission style cemetery or memorial. So very much a deviation from our traditional approach. It was a competition of South African architects. We had over 50 entries submitted. The education panel was chaired by Sir David Ajay, our CWGC's creative advisor. They selected the winning design, and it's going to be constructed in Cape Town's Company Garden. Very much a prominent location in Cape Town, and that we anticipate will be built next year into the year after. We're also building new memorials at Brookwood Military Cemetery in Surrey, the largest cemetery in the UK, and we're also building a similar memorial in Freetown, Sierra Leone, for West African casualties that were never properly commemorated. So quickly go through a little bit about the conservation and what we're doing. So we have operation teams throughout the world carrying on the work, great skill and commitment. Setting, very important setting when these cemeteries were designed. This is just a picture of Saiwan War Cemetery in Hong Kong. You can see the cemetery was designed to have the views looking out over into the harbor, Stanley Harbor. Saiwan, as it was in 1947. And here's a picture of what it looks like today. Completely different view. The vistas are gone. There's lots of trees that have grown up around. It's in the trees around are not. It's not our property. So the locations are the same, but the vistas have changed, and encroaching development is an issue in many of the countries out in the Far East. Natural challenges, locations. Some of them are very hard to get to. So Veda Bay on the left, it's an 8-hour drive from northern Russia to get there. One of our team members had to go in an old Soviet ambulance to get there. Muscat Old Cemetery in Oman, you've got to go by boat, or you've got to climb down the mountain to get to the cemetery. One of the natural challenges is very much an issue is flooding. This is Madras War Cemetery in India. Every year when the monsoon hits, the cemetery floods. We've been trying to do some flood deviation or mitigation issues. Cemetery is still flooding, so we're still working on it. And like clockwork, the monsoon rains are coming, and in Madras, Chennai, the monsoon rains are getting heavier and heavier every year, so it's a struggle. This is Freetown King Tom Cemetery, Sierra Leone. This was inundated with heavy rain and flooding in September 2015. Water came from the inside of the cemetery rather from the seaward side, and it pushed the seawall out into the sea. We almost lost the cemetery. Very difficult, challenging conditions. There's not a lot of resources in Sierra Leone. We can't get a local contractor to do the work for us. Very challenging. So we decided to do a different approach there. The seawall had to come out. It had already failed, and we put up gabion, which is the metal baskets filled with stone. So you'll see a picture of what the final different look, but it's a practical approach, and this actually slows down the waves hitting from the water side too. So different, but it's a way of preserving the cemetery. Vandalism and theft, very common. Chatham Naval Memorial in Kent. This is in the middle of a military base. We had the roof stolen. Here's a cemetery, Fosse 7 in France. Somebody put some rubbish bins up against the cemetery, lit it on fire. Fire damage, just all that stonework is going to have to be removed. You can't really fix it, and just lots of damage and staining to the stonework around it. Very common in countries where metal has got value. Ladysmith Cemetery in South Africa, the bronze sword was taken off. As they took the sword off, they ended up destroying the cross of sacrifice. Value of the sword is probably, I don't know, about £100. Caused us about £15,000 worth of damage. When that happens, we would put a fiberglass or a GRP sword up there in replacement. We wouldn't put a bronze sword back up because they'd probably come back in 6 weeks' time and do it again. So the very remote locations, they're not protected sites, so we take a more practical approach. The fiberglass swords are painted to look like a bronze sword, but they don't have any value, so people tend to leave them alone. War. We have lots of sites where we can't access anymore. Mosul War Cemetery, when ISIS came into northern Iraq, that was a regularly maintained cemetery, completely destroyed. We're in the process of securing the boundaries again, and when it's safe to go back in, we will restore the cemetery. And again, Yemen, civil war has been going on there for a number of years. The site's been destroyed, but it's just not safe for anybody to go in to do anything. So it will be repaired when we can. This is an unusual one. Ambon, Indonesia. This cross of sacrifice on the left, it was blown up during insurrection on the island. Rather than put a cross sacrifice back up, it's very much it's a country that's an island that's very much divided amongst Muslims and Christians, and there was quite serious violence going on in the late 90s, early 2000s. So the cross of sacrifice was blown up we assume that the Muslim side, as it's a Christian symbol. So rather than put a cross back up, we decided to go with the Stone of Remembrance. So that was one of the last, probably the last Stone of Remembrance we've had built to put back in. And it was seen to be less of a target in the future, and it hasn't been damaged since. Conservation. So a key consideration is the using original materials where possible. Not only it's a conservation-based approach we take now, and we want to maintain these structures for another 100 years to come. We're over 100 years old now. We want them to last in perpetuity. So this, one of our more common building projects, as I mentioned earlier, walls. We used a lot of cement in the past. Cement is a lot harder than the surrounding stonework or brickwork. It just causes the cement survives and the stonework is destroyed. So we have lots of failed or failing walls. So when we rebuild, we use lime mortar now, which is the sacrificial part as opposed to the brickwork. So the mortar is softer than the brick or the stonework. So that goes first rather than the brickwork deteriorating. Bronze protection. So I'll just show you an example. So those are the bronze plaques I mentioned earlier. In the past, in 25 years ago, someone thought it would be a good idea to, as a maintenance or a way to keep them lasting longer, they used industrial car paint. So we started using car paint on these plaques. Beautiful bronze plaque. They were painted and lacquered. It was no longer really a bronze plaque. It was a piece of metal with paint on it. Very toxic, very dangerous to apply. So we took a decision, rightly so, when we realized the amount of the risk to the staff actually putting the paint on and taking it off. So we decided to go back to a more traditional method. We've been doing some trials for the last couple of years, and we're actually using waxes now. So we strip off the existing coatings on the plaques, and then we use it's essentially a furniture wax, which we put on, and it's a lot easier to maintain. We don't have to strip it back every few years to repaint, so it can be touched up as and when required, and it's a lot safer for the staff to use. And it's a traditional method of protecting metalwork. And that's what it looks like after the fact. So you can see the paint being stripped off on this plaque on the left, and then on the right, that's with the wax. Looks better than it did before with the paint on it. And then here's an example of conservation projects. So I'll just show you all three pictures. On the left was the original entrance feature to the cemetery. It's in the cemetery in Belgium, designed by Edward Lutyens, flat roof. The roof was leaking. Someone restored it in the 60s. And when they rebuilt it, they decided not to put the top course on again. So it looked odd. And when we did some research before we were restoring the roof, we realized that, yes, it should have had the third top on. So when we redesigned and rebuilt the cemetery, we actually restored it to its original design and improved the drainage and improved the stonework on it. So it no longer leaks. And if we maintain it properly, we shouldn't have the same issues we had in the past. This was completed early 2020. And you can see here the damage that cement does to brickwork. Very soft bricks, very hard cement. The walls just fall apart. And then this is just an interior photograph of the brickwork being restored, the domed arches inside the entrance feature itself. Another conservation project we recently worked on at Runnymede Air Forces Memorial. During the 70s and 80s, the original design was overpainted with oil-based paint and acrylic paints. We lost detail in many areas. When we started stripping this back to restore it, we found all sorts of hidden original designs in the memorial, in the ceiling work and the paint work. So we used more natural paints. We didn't use acrylic and oil paints back, so we restored it back to the original look. So we didn't take all the original paintwork off. Where we could keep it, we did keep it. We stripped back the stuff that was put on it, overlaid on it, which we got off, and we actually restored it back to its original design. We use mineral-based paints, breathable. Acrylic paints and oil-based paints trap water in, and that was the problems we were having on the site. One of the last projects we did too, Liverpool Naval Memorial, part of a restoration project in 2019. Our masons here, this is Alistair. He's one of our masons in the UK. He worked with English Heritage, and we've had him for probably about 20 years. He hand carved these memorials from blocks of stone. The original globes were taken off in the 1990s, and because it's very close to the sea, the Mersey, very salty saline conditions, and the globes themselves were starting to deteriorate. So we replaced them with Botticino marble. It's a limestone / marble. It didn't look right. Botticino does not look like Portland. It doesn't age like Portland. So we took the decision to replace the globes back with the original Portland limestone. Been there for about 3 or 4 years. We're seeing a bit of deterioration again because Portland doesn't hold up particularly well against salt, but we're stabilizing it by we're using some methods to put protective coatings on the breathable coating. So we're going to use a lime wash on these globes to keep them going and keep the original design as it was intended. You can see the erosion on the bottom half of the memorial, how corrosive the salt water is on the memorial itself. A little bit on headstone legibility. So headstone replacement. So I mentioned earlier we replace about 25,000 headstones a year. It's not sustainable to be doing that. We couldn't afford it. So we re-engrave where possible. Full-time job for a small team. So I'll just show you how it actually works in practice. They have these small little shelters that the guys work on, work right through the winter. So they have a little heater in there for them to sit, and they sit on little benches where they can work. So keeps the sun off in the summer, and use portable heaters in the winter to keep them warm. Wait, I'll go back quickly. So this is, if you look here on the right-hand side, this is a headstone that's deteriorating. This is a headstone that's on the left-hand side that's been spun back and re-engraved. So another life of the headstone gives us another 20, 30 years out of the headstone. Cleaning. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. This is a challenge that we're working on now. Our headstones will be allowed to grow gracefully. There's been change of care over the years. We used a lot of preservatives in the 40s to try to protect them. We were cleaning the headstones on a 12-year cycle. We used chemicals and biocides from the 1970s, damaging to the environment, damaging to the stonework. And we started cleaning them quite a bit. So you go into the cemeteries in France and Belgium, they weren't originally pristine white cemeteries, but there's been a bit of an expectation for these bright white cemeteries now. We can't do it anymore. We can't use the chemicals. We can't use the cleaning methods. So we're trying different methodologies now to try and maintain them in it as they should look their age. So we don't want bright white headstones. We want them to be legible. They need to commemorate the casualty. They need to look cared for. So we're actually trying enzymes now, which are it's an agent that actually eats the dirt. So we're trying that in various sites. We're not trying it. We're using it in Belgium now. We're trying it in the UK, and that will replace the chemicals that we've been using over the years. We do a lot of we were using steam cleaners. It works, but it's also damaging to the stonework too. It's just, again, whenever you clean something, you can damage it. So we're trying to avoid the cleaning, and just we're finding methods that will preserve the life of the stone. So cleanliness. So our main principles of our cleanliness standard now is there should not be any substantial change to the appearance. So there will be a change in color. They won't be bright white, but they will look cared for. They should never look neglected. And we have to balance the effects of aging and caring with the environment. We can't just keep on putting chemicals into the ground, and putting the chemicals also on the headstones actually killed the plants in front too. So there was just negative issues with that. So we only clean where required now. We don't go in and clean every headstone because we have a team there. We only clean where required. So under trees where they get dirtier, we clean. And yeah, so we clean when needed now, not just because we have a cycle. So I think that is the end of my presentation. It probably took a bit longer than expected because I don't have my watch out. It did. I'm sorry. I will stop this sharing now. And any questions? I'm really sorry I took too long. I got lost in it.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was absolutely fascinating. There aren't any questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
I see a hand for someone named Elizabeth, who I suspect I know.
Elizabeth, would you like to ask?
Yes, please. Hi, Chris. Yeah,
Hi, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth Otter here. I was wondering, with large buildings such as Teetval and Melling Gate, that have sort of so many layers of significance, both in terms of they were designed by notable architects, but also they're now historic buildings that are part of the landscape that they now inhabit, but also at the centre you've got that commemoration in perpetuity aspect as well. Do you have a process by which, or a checklist by which, where you decide what takes precedent? Because is there ever a conflict between any of those things, and sometimes one has to pay off towards the other?
Well, our primary raison d'etre for the commission is to commemorate by name. So we always have to ensure that the casualties are commemorated and legible and readable. But we are taking a more using a more sustainable approach now. So we can't do what we were doing 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. So there is going to be a trade-off in certain cases, but we have to balance it. We have limited budgets too. So it's a challenge, and it's a big challenge. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to use enzymes now as opposed to biocides, get away from using fertilizers, pesticides. We're trying to get away from that as much as we can, but also trying to maintain. So it is we're still learning. We're still working on different methods of doing it, but yeah. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. We have another question from Rosemary. Would you like to ask your question?
Thanks, Chris, for an absolutely fantastic talk, really wide-ranging. My question is about landscape. Could you say something about the strategy that you're taking? I can see a very kind of conservation-based approach for the memorials themselves. Perhaps the very clipped lawns might be something I would quite like to ask about, why you're continuing with that approach. Also, some of the earlier photographs showed much more, much larger shrubbery in places, particularly along paths. Now it seems to be either clipped lawns, and also in front of the memorial stones themselves, there seems to be, there is obviously some planting. Is the planting designed by yourselves, or is there any personalised family planting allowed adjacent to the stones?
So the planting itself is done entirely by commission staff. If you go into some isolated cemeteries in the UK, you might have a scattered headstone or a scattered grave in a UK churchyard. Some of those are taken on by the church or locals would put something in. We try to discourage any sort of planting if we own the graves. If we don't, it's a bit more difficult, but nobody is allowed to plant anything in our cemeteries themselves. It's done by the staff. Designs have been changed over time. The clipped grass itself, we have, it's still showing, we're supposed to be cutting it to about 35 mil now. Some people are still doing it a little bit shorter. We are working with our teams to try and get a more standardized approach. We had 5 different areas operating and 5 different areas doing 5 different things. So we have taken a more centralized approach to things. We're rolling out inspections. So we have different inspection sites. I'm not a horticulturalist, so I'm going to touch onto this, but our horticulturalists, the teams, they do an inspection where they rate against the grass and weeds in the grass and what's acceptable in the planting and stuff. So there's a whole criteria that is used to determine what would be done in a cemetery when they go in there next to renovate the site, or if they are cutting the grass too short, someone would have a word with the gardeners and say, stop cutting the grass every week. It doesn't need to be cut every week. It needs to be cut every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but we want to keep it at a little bit higher. It encourages insects in the grass. It encourages wildlife or biodiversity too. If we cut the grass too short, nothing really grows in there. And it also burns the grass too when it gets really hot in the summer. So we're adapting how we do things.
There's a follow-on question from Wesley Kerr in the chat about that. Have you considered cutting the grass less frequently and encouraging meadows, or is neatness expected?
Yes and yes. So the grass is being cut less now. It used to be cut to 20 mil. I think it's now 35 mil. We are trying to put some wildlife meadows in, or strips around the back. So I think at Brookwood Cemetery, we're trying that out. Harrogate Stonefall, if you go up to Harrogate, we've actually got some wildlife meadow areas growing there. And some of the larger sites, we are reviewing where there's grass and it doesn't need to be grass, yes. Oh, I can't hear you, Rowena.
That's a question.
No, I can't hear.
Hi.
There we go. Hi, Nikos.
You hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi from North Greece, actually, where we do have also cemeteries from the Commonwealth Commission, and visited some of them. I wanted to ask other questions, but because all the recent comments were about the natural aspect of the cemeteries.
Yeah.
For example, here in Greece, and mainly in Athens, it looks strange, to be honest, especially during summer, where we are struggling with fires and with more dry climate because of climate change, to see how green the cemetery looks like. So I'm wondering whether, as you have mentioned, all these new developments about readdressing commemoration, whether the climate change has been actually placed on the heart now of how this is going to affect not just the marbles and the stones, but also the natural aspect of the cemeteries, and whether it is possible to change how the cemetery looks, or it should be preserved despite the new rules. Thank you.
No, we are very much looking at that. We're using water, and there's a bit of we're a bit uncomfortable with we use a lot of water to keep the grass growing. It looks like green English country garden, which was the original design. We are reviewing whether it is appropriate for us to be using water when it's a limited resource, especially in certain countries where Egypt is a prime example. We've got green grass in Heliopolis War Cemetery. People struggle for water. We're drilling boreholes. So we are reviewing how we're doing it. And we're going to address and try put more natural grasses in. So rather than have the traditional grass in there, we'll put a different grass in that's a lot more drought tolerant and a lot more targeted irrigation. So rather than having sprinkler systems in there, we would have trickle feeders along. We'll put different plants in that are a lot more drought tolerant. We've got sites, like I said, El Alamein is a good example of a site where we did not put grass in. We've got sites out in Kenya and Tanzania where we have just, it's either stone or just natural sand with very, very local plants. So we are looking at that again and revisiting, because it doesn't sit well with people when we're using water when people are struggling to find fresh water. Yes.
A few more questions in the chat. Patricia has already answered Helen's question about the original target design by so that leaves Rob Burgos is asking, volunteers help with completing?
Yeah. Yes, we have a program in the UK called Eyes On, Hands On. So we have volunteers, which are, there's a volunteer program where you could register with the Commission for various regions around the UK. We have the volunteers check or inspect our isolated graves. So if it's a scattered grave and you might have 3 or 4 cemeteries in the town you're working or you're volunteering in, you would go and check those headstones on a periodic basis. You can give them a scrub with nylon brush and water. Nothing else. We had well-intentioned people using bleach on headstones, all sorts of chemical, and it kills the stone. So we encourage, we have volunteer coordinators who assign volunteers in the UK areas, and they do physical visual inspections for us. They don't actually physically work on the headstones apart from cleaning, giving them a scrub with clean water and a brush. But yes, if anybody's interested in the UK, if you go to our website, or you can get my email details. I happily to give my email details, and you can fire me an email and I can forward it on to the volunteer coordinators in the UK.
Thank you, Chris. We've got one last question in the chat, which is probably a good one to finish on. Could you tell us more about further fundraising for specific projects that you've mentioned?
So this is quite new to us. We were always very much we were funded by the member governments, but we have been looking at in various countries. So Flemish in Flanders and Belgium, we've had funding for carrying out work on the Menin Gate. So Flemish Heritage, they have a program. Our sites are protected in Flanders, so we are able to apply for grants for doing work in Belgium. We got some grant money for working on the Chepval Memorial in France. England, I don't think we've had any funding. We don't have a lot of memorial. We have the big memorials in the UK, but we only got 7 or 8 of them. So we don't have any large scale renovation projects in the UK. But if something does come up, we would probably look at avenues of funding now. But actually fundraising for the Commission to raise money to carry on works on our memorial, our member government. So the Ministry of Defence funds us for about 78% of our budget every year. Canadian government funds us about 10%. The Australians fund us about 7%. New Zealand, South Africa, and India are about 1% each. So we are funded. So fundraising for actually carrying out our maintenance work and maintaining the cemeteries, we don't actually fundraise for, but we have something called the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation, which is a charity that was set up to sit alongside the War Graves Commission, and that's they raise money to raise awareness of the Commission, talk about what the Commission does, why we do things. So there is a charitable wing of the Commission, but it's not used for funding the work that we actually carry out.
Thank you, Chris. I think given the time, and I don't think there are any more questions, we'll draw it to a close there, but thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. I
like to ramble on, I'm sorry.
There have been lots and lots of positive comments in the chat, so do have a look at those, lots of positive feedback. Thank you very much indeed. If you are interested in learning more about the CWGC, have a look at their website. And if you want to learn more about the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, then have a look at our website. we've got various news, and there are previous talks from our other talk series available on there. You can find out more about the work we're doing, some really exciting projects training people up in heritage skills. So do have a look at our website, and do join us for future talks. And if there's anybody that you know who would be interested in listening to Chris's talk, then it should be made available in the next couple of weeks on our website, so other people can hear it as well. So that just leaves me to say another big thank you to Chris for kicking off the first
It's a pleasure.
series. I hope you will all be able to join us for future talks. Thank you.
Right. Take care.